The first clue sits in a civil defense handbook stamped by Tokyo authorities: do not panic. Extinguish promptly. Prevent spread. It reads like a promise. Yet the archival footage I've reviewed, silent reels shot after the raid, shows streets erased to pale ash, as if a giant eraser passed over the wards east of the Imperial Palace. On March 9, 1945, women in working smocks and mock trousers reported to neighborhood fire squads before dusk, following pre-war routines now hardened into doctrine. Japan's homefront system leaned on them because it had to. Able-bodied men were in uniform, and factory shifts ran long under wartime rationing. The strategy on the American side was equally deliberate. U.S. planners mapped Tokyo's flammability, marking the Shitamachi districts where wooden homes, workshops, and narrow lanes formed a single contiguous fuel bed. The question was not whether bombs would fall, but whether the city could smother thousands of small fires before they fused into one enormous one. The strike force that night, Operation Meetinghouse, was built around the B-29, a technological leap, pressurized, long-ranged, built to haul heavy loads across the Pacific. But the innovation that mattered most over Tokyo was not the airframe, it was the incendiary. The principal weapon, the M69, was a small canister of jellied gasoline, napalm-like, designed to burst and spit fire into attics, paper screens, and tatami. Each B-29 could scatter hundreds, turning neighborhoods into ignition grids. U.S. tactics shifted to low-altitude night bombing to improve accuracy and maximize burn effects. Defensive guns were reduced on many aircraft to carry more incendiaries. On the ground, Tokyo's women faced a grim asymmetry. Their tools, bucket brigades, hand pumps, sand, wet blankets, were designed for isolated blazes, not for planned saturation ignition. Civil defense doctrine assumed the enemy would deliver fires as discrete events. What arrived was a system: pathfinders, wind exploitation, and time density, an industrial method for creating urban combustion. Shortly after midnight, the first waves approached. Radar warnings and sirens did not automatically equal safety. Shelters were shallow, many families hesitated, and some trusted that Tokyo, capital of the empire, would be spared the worst. In diaries preserved from the period, women note the same sequence: the wail, the scramble for water, the shock of seeing the sky brighten as if dawn had come early. Pathfinders dropped incendiaries to mark the box, then the main force sowed fire in expanding patterns. The tactical concept was to create a broad burning area so intense it would generate its own wind, a firestorm, pulling oxygen inward and flinging embers outward like living ammunition. For neighborhood brigades, the first minutes mattered most. Women and girls ran roof to roof beating sparks with wet futons, dragging water from communal taps, working in teams assigned by block associations. Many believed they could win locally, until the wind rose and individual fires began to link, jumping streets in seconds. Here the harsh logistics of late-war Japan intrudes. Tokyo's water mains and pressure were unreliable under bombing and neglect. Equipment was scarce, fuel shortages hampered emergency transport. Even the city's professional firefighters were stretched thin, and their engines could not be everywhere at once. As the raid intensified, heat and smoke made command impossible, shouted orders vanished, lanterns went out, and landmarks disappeared. The human experience, and survivor testimony, is brutally consistent: women carrying children, elderly parents, bundles of ration cards, and a single kettle because someone insisted boiled water might be needed. Many fled toward open spaces and the Sumida River, a rational choice taught in civil defense training. Water and wide embankments could serve as fire breaks. But the American plan counted on density and wind. Incendiaries struck along likely escape corridors. The fire front moved faster than feet. In some accounts, women recall hair singeing as they ran, then realizing the air itself had become weaponized, superheated, oxygen-starved, and full of burning fragments. The Black River of the title appears in multiple post-raid descriptions: the Sumida, choked with bodies and debris, its surface filmed with soot and oil, reflecting an orange sky. People entered the water to escape radiant heat. Some drowned, some suffocated as smoke pressed down, and others were trapped against embankments when crowds surged. The American operational goal, cripple urban industry by destroying workers' homes and small workshops, collided with a civilian reality. Whole families lived where they worked, and women formed the connective tissue of that economy. Their wartime labor had already been stretched by ration lines, factory conscription, and blackout duty. Now it became evacuation, rescue, and, often, impossible choices about whom to carry. By dawn on March 10, 1945, vast areas of eastern Tokyo were flattened. The tactical success of the raid rested on technology, M69 clusters, weather, and altitude choices. The human cost rested on the city's structure and on the shoulders of civilians, especially women, who were expected to hold a home front that had turned into a front line. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. At the U.S. end, the night was engineered like an experiment. Declassified after-action summaries show a deliberate sequence, Pathfinder aircraft first, then the mainstream, with spacing intended to keep a continuous fall of incendiaries over the target box. The key tactical choice, low level, at night, reduced exposure to the jet stream and increased concentration, but it also meant crews flew through smoke columns and updraft turbulence generated by the fires below. On the Japanese side, the air defense system was mismatched to the threat. Searchlights and heavy anti-aircraft guns had been designed to catch higher-altitude bombers. At low altitude the engagement window shrank, and fire control struggled in smoke and haze. Women on the ground, meanwhile, watched the sky throb with engine noise and the flicker of flares, trying to interpret it like weather. Many accounts mention a cruel rhythm. Each lull suggested the raid was ending, then another wave arrived. The psychological effect was operational. Hesitation delayed evacuation, and minutes lost became distances the fire front erased. The B-29 itself mattered because it made repetition possible. Its range from the Marianas turned Tokyo into a target that could be revisited, and its payload turned neighborhoods into fuel. For Operation Meetinghouse, bomb bays carried mostly incendiary clusters. Crews reported dropping patterns that looked like strings and carpets. Technical notes from the period emphasize how the M69's casing popped at a set height, scattering bomblets designed to lodge in structures before igniting, an answer to Japanese firefighting methods that relied on quick smothering. Japan had counters on paper, firebreak plans, demolition teams, bucket brigades, and neighborhood wardens. But the economy had been tightened by blockade and loss of shipping. Materials and spare parts were scarce, and by 1945 many districts still had tightly packed wooden buildings. Women were assigned civil defense tasks because the state assumed they were available, yet they were also factory hands, caregivers, and ration managers. In the archival stills, you can see the result: burnt sewing machines, warped cookware, and melted glass. Home industry and household labor fused into the same ash. A firestorm is not just many fires, it is a self-feeding system. Meteorological data and survivor statements align on the same turning point. Once enough blocks burned at once, the heated air rose and drew in oxygen like a bellows. That inflow became wind strong enough to knock people down and to pull sparks across canals and streets that should have stopped flames. Women trying to shepherd children described breathing that felt like swallowing sand. Some wrapped faces in wet cloth, a technique taught in drills, only to find the cloth drying almost instantly. Civil defense also depended on communication, whistles, shouted orders, neighborhood chiefs, but the roar drowned it out. Tactical control on the ground collapsed into instinct: follow a wall, cling to a family member, head toward water, avoid alleys that became chimneys. The U.S. strategy exploited this physics, not by targeting centers, but by igniting an area so large that human decision-making could not keep pace. In that sense, the raid was as much applied thermodynamics as it was air power. One of the most revealing sources is the mundane paperwork of survival: ration cards, neighborhood rosters, factory attendance lists, documents later used to identify the missing. Women often carried these papers during flight, because without them a family could not claim food, charcoal, or emergency relief. That detail exposes the logistical truth: even in disaster, the wartime state functioned through documentation. After dawn, relief stations struggled with shortages caused by months of bombing and shipping losses, burned districts meant burned stockpiles, and transport was choked by rubble. Here strategy links to economy. U.S. submarines and mining had strangled Japan's import flows, so rebuilding capacity and emergency reserves were thin. Many women returned to find not merely a destroyed home but the loss of tools, looms, small presses, carpentry benches that fed subcontract work for the war economy. The raid thus struck production indirectly by turning skilled household labor into displacement. In testimonies, the shock is not only grief but arithmetic. Where will we sleep? How will we eat? How can we report for our shift? War reduced life to logistics. The Black River riddle resolves in layers. It is literal, soot, oil, and debris staining the Sumida, and it is bureaucratic. The river became a boundary in later damage maps, a dark seam between annihilated wards and those less burned. It is also moral. A city's escape route turned into a trap because planners on both sides understood where people would run. Post-raid U.S. analysis teams compared reconnaissance photos before and after, calculating burned acreage and estimating industrial disruption. Japan's own internal reports, where they survived, tracked shelter capacity and corpse disposal. Women appear everywhere in these records, not as footnotes but as the primary actors of the home front, rescuers, evacuees, nurses, and, afterward, rebuilders. Yet their agency had limits set by policy and material. The night of September 10, March 1945 shows a convergence: American tactical adaptation, Japanese defensive inadequacy, and a civilian society stretched so thin that the people tasked with extinguishing promptly had almost no means left to do it. Morning on March 10, 1945 did not look like victory or defeat, it looked like inventory. In ward offices and surviving schools, clerks, often women, began the brutal accounting: names, addresses, ration numbers, last known locations. Charge streets erased house numbers, so identification relied on neighborhood memory and scraps of paperwork recovered from pockets. Photographs taken in the days after show long lines at water points and impromptu kitchens, because cooking fuel and utensils had vanished with the houses. This is where strategy becomes human. The U.S. aimed to disrupt production by destroying dense worker housing, forced Japan to divert labor into debris clearance and emergency sheltering, precisely when factories needed hands. Yet the state's response was constrained by logistics. Truck fuel was scarce, rail lines were strained, medical supplies were already rationed. Women did the work that kept the city functioning, washing burns with limited clean water, boiling thin porridge, stitching clothing from remnants. In Diaries, the recurring phrase is not air raid but after we counted, after we searched, after we burned the dead. Tokyo's civil defense system had been built around neighborhood organizations, and in peacetime that structure could feel like community. After the firestorm it became a chain of obligation: report casualties, accept evacuees, return to assigned labor if physically able. Government guidance urged survivors to disperse to relatives in the countryside, partly to reduce urban mouths to feed. The economic subtext is stark. Japan's food supply depended on tight rationing and on moving rice and vegetables into the capital despite Allied interdiction. Women became logisticians of the family, trading clothing for food, navigating paperwork to receive rations in new districts, negotiating with local officials. American intelligence also tracked these dislocations. Reconnaissance images and intercepted communications helped estimate whether Tokyo could sustain industrial output and whether morale was cracking. The raid's tactical success could be measured in burned acreage. Its strategic value depended on whether displacement reduced manufacturing and strained governance. From the ground view, women read strategy as hunger, distance, and the sudden vulnerability of children without schools, shoes, or medicine. The technological story did not end with one raid, it accelerated. After Meetinghouse, incendiary attacks on Japanese cities continued, and the lessons were compiled with clinical precision: optimal bombing altitude, spacing, and bomb mix. This is the arms race in practice, defense and offense learning at different speeds. Japan attempted countermeasures: more dispersion, more camouflage, increased use of tunnels and shelters, greater emphasis on firebreaks. But by 1945, the material basis for large-scale adaptation was collapsing. Cement, steel, pumps, hoses, everything competed with the military's needs and with disrupted transport. In a surviving municipal report, the tone is administrative, almost detached, yet the content is desperate, requests for equipment that could not be delivered. Women, meanwhile, were being mobilized into additional war work even as their households were shattered. The paradox is central. The state demanded more labor from the very people whose living space had just been erased. The raid thus acted like a lever, forcing society to operate at a tempo beyond its physical capacity. A quieter battlefield opened in the weeks that followed. Information. The U.S. began dropping leaflets over Japanese cities warning of impending raids and urging evacuation, part humanitarian gesture, part psychological pressure, part attempt to clog transport and governance with refugee flows. Japanese authorities often collected these leaflets and punished their circulation, fearing panic and defeatism. Here the covert dimension is subtle. Leaflets were paired with reconnaissance and target analysis, feeding a cycle of observation and message. Women were central to this information war because they managed households and networks, what neighbors said, which family had left, who could offer shelter. Rumor became a form of intelligence, and authorities tried to control it. Some women hid leaflets to show relatives, others destroyed them to avoid arrest. In police records and post-war testimonies, the same tension appears, private decisions made under public surveillance. The firestorm had burned buildings, but it also scorched trust between citizens and state, and between what people saw with their eyes and what they were told to believe. Within the Japanese leadership, the raid sharpened an already grim debate: how to defend cities when aircraft and fuel were insufficient. Fighter units faced shortages of trained pilots and aviation gasoline, radar coverage and coordination were imperfect, anti-aircraft ammunition was finite. This is strategy under scarcity. Some planners still clung to the idea of inflicting decisive losses on B-29 formations, but the tactical reality of night, low altitude, and massed incendiaries made that increasingly difficult. Civilians, again, disproportionately women, were pushed towards self-help measures that assumed a controllable threat. Yet Meetinghouse proved the threat could be systematized beyond civilian capacity to respond. The archival images of women sweeping ash from doorways that no longer existed capture a turning point. Tokyo was no longer merely enduring war, it was being methodically unmade. The Sumida's black surface becomes, in this segment of the story, a metaphor for a capital running out of options, military, economic, and human, while still expected to produce weapons, obey orders, and keep children alive. Spring 1945 turned Tokyo's catastrophe into a pattern repeated across Japan. The same mechanics, B-29 streams, incendiary loadouts, low-altitude night approaches, were applied to other cities, but Tokyo remained the administrative nerve center trying to coordinate national survival. Evacuation orders expanded, sending schoolchildren and mothers into rural prefectures where food was also tight and housing scarce. Local records show friction, villages suddenly responsible for hundreds of outsiders, with ration allotments that did not match mouths. Women, again, became the adapters, finding substitute foods, bartering labor for vegetables, converting temples and storehouses into dormitories. Strategically, dispersal reduced immediate urban casualties, yet it also strained transport and undermined industrial rhythms that relied on punctual attendance. U.S. planners understood this. If the workforce could not live near workshops, output would fall even without directly hitting a factory roof. The war's center of gravity slid from machines to people, where they slept, what they ate, whether they could walk to work, and women were the ones making those daily calculations under impossible constraints. Damage assessment after March 10 was not guesswork, it was mapped. Aerial photographs were compared with pre-raid city grids to calculate burn percentages by ward, and Japanese municipal offices produced their own charts when they still had paper, ink, and staff. These documents read cold, but they capture a truth about modern war: destruction becomes data. Women's accounts supply what maps cannot: how it felt when the air itself burned. Several testimonies describe the moment shelter failed, heat forcing people out, smoke crawling low, the sound of buildings collapsing like continuous thunder. Technically, those descriptions match Firestorm behavior: convection columns, oxygen draw, and ember transport that leaps barriers. Strategically, the raid also tested an assumption within U.S. command that incendiary area bombing would yield faster results than continued high-altitude attempts at industrial precision. Tokyo became the case study used to justify the wider campaign. For survivors, the case study was a missing sister, a burned child's hands, a mother's decision at a riverbank. Data and grief coexisted, but they never spoke the same language. What did Japanese air defense learn? Less than it wanted, and later than it needed. Night fighter development and radar integration existed, but shortages of skilled technicians, parts, and fuel limited effectiveness. Some intercepts occurred, anti-aircraft batteries did fire, individual B-29s were lost. Yet the American tactic of massed sorties, staggered timing, and incendiary saturation meant that even a successful defense could not prevent widespread ignition. Meanwhile, the home front was pushed toward harsher mobilization, more labor drafts, more collection drives, more obligations for women to serve in factories and civil defense simultaneously. It was an economy consuming itself. In a surviving school register, neat handwriting marks which students were evaluated, absent, or deceased, a ledger of national exhaustion. Women carried the burden of continuity, keeping family lines intact, safeguarding documents, tending the injured, and trying to return to work because wages and ration eligibility depended on it. The raid was not just a night of fire, it was a long campaign of administrative survival. Censorship shaped what could be said during the war, which is why post-war testimonies are essential, and why diaries that escaped confiscation are so valuable. Some women wrote in coded language: the night of wind, the night the sky fell, the night of endless footsteps. Others recorded practical details, where water still ran, which bridges were passable, that read like field intelligence. In the U.S., photographic intelligence and crew debriefs were equally meticulous, but emotionally distant: altitude, heading, bomb release time, fires observed. Put together, the archive becomes a stereoscopic image, one lens operational, one lens human. The covert element here is not a commando raid, it is the quiet struggle over narrative. Who controlled the meaning of the firestorm? Authorities sought order, survivors carried trauma, occupiers later gathered data for war crimes trials and for strategic analysis. Women's voices, often minimized in formal histories, are the connective tissue that turns urban bombing doctrine into lived reality, revealing how policy decisions translate into the weight of a child in your arms and the choice of which street might still exist. So what turned the Sumida black? Soot, yes, carbon from millions of tatami mats, paper walls, and wooden beams atomized into the air and then washed down into the water. Oil, too, spilled from workshops, lanterns, and broken stores, spreading a film that caught ash like ink. Debris and bodies, because the river became both refuge and bottleneck, and because firestorms can make open water feel like the only remaining safe terrain. But the deeper answer is design, a raid shaped by reconnaissance, weapon engineering, and an urban plan that unintentionally offered perfect fuel. The women of Tokyo were trained to fight ordinary fires with ordinary tools. They were confronted with a manufactured climate event. Their heroism was real: bucket lines, rescues, improvised first aid, yet bravery could not compensate for collapsed water pressure, exhausted infrastructure, and an enemy tactic built around mass ignition. The mystery resolves into a documentary truth: the river went black when strategy met physics, and when the home front, carried largely by women, was forced to absorb a front line that had moved into kitchens, schoolrooms, and streets.